In a small town where corruption thrived in the shadows, the Iron Fangs believed they were untouchable, their reign unchallenged. When Naomi Carter arrived, they saw just another outsider, alone, vulnerable, someone they could intimidate into silence. They had no idea the woman they cornered was a former Marine, that the dogs at her side were trained military canines, or that they had just declared war on someone who had spent years surviving battles far deadlier than anything they could imagine. What started as a simple act of harassment would spiral into something much bigger, an all-out fight for justice that would unravel the gang's entire operation. Before they realized their mistake, their power would be shattered, their secrets exposed, and the woman they underestimated would be the one standing over the ruins of everything they had built. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden beams across the quiet suburban streets, painting the sidewalks with the warmth of a seemingly peaceful town. Naomi Carter walked at an even pace, her boots hitting the pavement in a steady rhythm. To any onlooker, she was just another resident, taking her dogs for an evening stroll. But there was something in her posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, that hinted at a deeper sense of awareness. This was a woman who knew how to command space, a woman who had been trained to move with purpose. At her sides, Max and Bolt trotted effortlessly, their lean, muscular forms alert but relaxed. The German Shepherd and Belgian Malinois had been with her through more battles than most men could stomach. They had saved her life more than once, and in return, she had given them something more than discipline. She had given them trust. No leash was needed. Her quiet commands were enough. They knew to stay close, to listen, to be ready. The quiet town she had moved to nearly 5 months ago had seemed, at first, like the perfect place to start over. A fresh beginning after years of deployments, of training soldiers, of watching lives slip through her fingers in the harshest corners of the world. She had chosen solitude, avoiding the entanglements of local gossip and neighborhood small talk. Most of the townspeople had ignored her presence entirely, while others gave her those looks, silent, measuring gazes that told her she would always be seen as an outsider. It didn't bother her. She wasn't here to make friends. But something about the past few weeks had set her instincts on edge. She had noticed an unusual presence in the areas surrounding her usual walking route. A parked truck that never seemed to move. A group of men lingering near the gas station just outside the residential block. Conversations that abruptly stopped when she passed by. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but her gut was telling her something was off. And Naomi Carter had long since learned that her gut was never wrong. Max's ears flicked forward suddenly, his body tensing for the briefest moment before resuming his pace. Naomi didn't react outwardly, but she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline sharpen her senses. She wasn't alone. She continued walking, slowing her pace slightly as she reached the secluded edge of town where the sidewalks gave way to a quiet stretch of road lined with dense trees. The tension in her chest coiled tighter, an unspoken warning from somewhere deep inside her bones. She wasn't sure what, but something was coming, and she would be ready. Naomi Carter didn't break her stride, but she had long since mastered the ability to scan her surroundings without making it obvious. The moment Max's posture shifted, even subtly, she knew something was about to change. Bolt, always the more intuitive of the two, had slowed his pace just slightly, his gaze flicking toward the tree line that bordered the cracked pavement. She inhaled deeply through her nose, keeping her movements measured. The streetlights hadn't yet flickered on, and the shadows were growing longer. The further she walked, the quieter it became, save for the occasional rustling of the trees swaying in the cool breeze. Then, almost too perfectly timed, she caught the sound of a vehicle approaching behind her. Not fast, not a typical pass-by, slow, deliberate. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she resisted the urge to turn her head. Instead, she listened. The engine was old, the low rumbling indicating a heavy-duty truck, probably American-made. It rolled to a near crawl, keeping pace with her for several long seconds before pulling up ahead, Just past the narrow opening of a dirt path leading into the woods, it came to a stop. No one got out. Max and Bolt both turned their heads now, the shift in their breathing subtle but telling. They were waiting for her command. Naomi exhaled slowly, never losing her rhythm as she approached the vehicle. There were at least 4 figures inside, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. Her boots crunched against the gravel lining the shoulder of the road, her heartbeat steady, her body loose but ready. The driver's door opened, then the passenger side, and then, just as she had suspected, the back doors swung open, releasing the unmistakable stench of cigarette smoke, cheap beer, and something else she couldn't quite place. But whatever it was unpleasant. It hit her in a slow, creeping wave, the kind that lingered too long and clung to the back of her throat, the kind that told her she had stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time. 4 men stepped out, each moving with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. There was no hesitation, no scrambling or confusion. They weren't just spilling out into the night. They were spreading, positioning themselves with deliberate precision, not too obvious, not too rushed, just enough to make it clear that she was being boxed in. It wasn't overtly aggressive, not yet, but the intent was there. Simmering beneath the surface like embers waiting to catch fire, she kept walking. "Evening, sweetheart," the stocky one called out, his voice coated in mockery, oozing a forced friendliness that was just a little too slick to be genuine. His stance was casual, his grin easy, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, assessing, waiting to see how she reacted. The lanky one beside him let out a low chuckle, the sound almost lazy, almost amused, but not quite. "Bit late for a walk, ain't it?" His voice was lighter, but there was an edge to it, an unspoken weight beneath the words. Naomi didn't break her stride, but she felt their eyes on her, tracking her every movement, dissecting her body language, watching, measuring, deciding. The stocky one stepped into her path. She stopped. Not because she was intimidated, not because she was nervous, but because she had already calculated the scenario in her head, and it was better to let them speak first, to learn their angle before deciding her next move. The silence stretched between them, thick with expectation. "You're new around here," Stocky said, tilting his head slightly. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a statement of fact. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Just moved in," she said evenly, her voice giving away nothing. His grin widened, slow and knowing. "That right? See, the thing is, we've been having some issues lately." Naomi didn't respond, just waited. The lanky one took a step closer, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his oversized jacket. "You've been taking a lot of walks," he mused, his tone casual, conversational even, but there was something deliberate in the way he said it, the way he let the words settle. "Always out by the edge of town, near places you shouldn't be." That's when it clicked. She finally understood where this was going. They thought she was watching them. She exhaled slowly, keeping her breathing measured, steady. "I walk my dogs. That's all?" The third man, standing slightly behind the others, let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that carried just a little too much amusement, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. "Yeah? See? That's a real funny coincidence." He glanced at the others before turning his gaze back to her. "'Cause a couple nights ago we had someone snooping around our property. Ain't from town, ain't supposed to be there." Stocky's grin sharpened. "And wouldn't you know it? Looked an awful lot like you." The accusation was clear now. They weren't just harassing her for fun. They were convinced she was a cop, or worse, someone working against them. Naomi didn't react. Her breathing remained steady, her posture neutral. "You sure got a real professional air about you," the lanky one continued, his smirk turning thoughtful. "Ain't like the folks around here. The way you carry yourself, the way those dogs listen to you without a word." Max and Bolt stood silent at her sides, still waiting, still watching. "People like you?" He leaned in slightly. "They don't just walk places. They look for things. And We don't like people looking for things. Naomi held his gaze. You're mistaken. Stocky's grin didn't waver. See? Here's the thing. I don't believe you. He moved fast, reaching for her. His fingers clamped around her wrist. That was his mistake. Naomi exploded into motion, twisting her arm free in a seamless motion while her opposite elbow drove into his throat. Stocky stumbled back, gasping, eyes wide in shock as he choked on the impact. Then everything happened at once. The lanky one lunged at her, but Bolt was faster. The Malinois slammed into him, sending him crashing onto the pavement. The third man grabbed at Max's harness and immediately regretted it. Max spun, his teeth clamping down onto the man's arm, dragging him off balance before releasing him with a warning snarl. Naomi barely had time to register the fourth man lunging before she moved. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward, then drove her knee into his ribs. Stocky recovered, stumbling forward in blind fury. You... Naomi pivoted, hooking his leg out from under him, sending him crashing back to the ground. Silence fell. The men who weren't downed scrambled to regain their footing. They were no longer laughing. Naomi stood her ground, her breath even, her hands loose at her sides. Max and Bolt remained locked in position beside her, poised, waiting. Stocky pushed himself onto his elbows, his expression darkening with something deeper than anger. Something more dangerous. You think this is over? He spat, his voice ragged. You think you just walk away? Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice eerily calm. You touched me first. Stocky's eyes burned with fury. But then he smirked. You made a mistake, he said. A slow clap echoed from the truck. Naomi turned. A figure stepped out from the driver's side. He was different from the others. No nervous energy, no anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Just a quiet, controlled presence. Duke Calloway. She had never met him, but she knew from the way the other men looked at him, from the way he carried himself, from the cold amusement in his ice-blue eyes. Well, he drawled, stopping just short of stepping into the circle of his fallen men. This is a problem. He surveyed the scene. The men on the ground, the ones still recovering, Naomi standing firm. His mouth twitched in something resembling amusement. See? I don't like problems, he continued, his voice smooth, too casual. And I sure as hell don't like people asking questions they shouldn't be asking. Naomi didn't respond. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. You should have just minded your own business. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to catch the glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. A second truck. More men. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Naomi Carter stood motionless, her breath measured, her stance firm as Duke Calloway stepped forward, his gaze flicking between the bruised and battered men at her feet. His expression barely shifted, but she caught the slight tensing of his jaw, the way his fingers curled for just a fraction of a second before relaxing again. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't surprised either. He studied her, his pale blue eyes assessing, searching for weakness. A slow, deliberate scrutiny that spoke of experience, of someone who had done this before. Naomi had seen men like him before, calculating, controlled, the kind who built their power not just on brute force, but on the ability to manipulate and control others, the kind who knew exactly how far they could push before breaking someone. The headlights from the second truck grew brighter as it approached, the low hum of its engine punctuating the silence like a steady drumbeat. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it was deafening. She could hear the gravel crunch beneath its tires as it pulled up alongside the first vehicle, the weight of it pressing into the dirt. The doors swung open. 2 more men stepped out. Unlike the first group, these men were bigger, more solidly built, the kind of muscle people hired when they wanted to make a statement. There was no swagger in their movements, no smirks or casual amusement. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to finish the job. Enforcement. Naomi shifted subtly, barely a movement, but enough to place herself between them and her dogs. Max and Bolt remained poised, silent, their bodies tense and coiled, waiting for her command. Their ears were pricked forward, sharp eyes locked onto the men in front of them. Calloway exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, as if this whole ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience. He shook his head slightly, as if disappointed. "You should have just walked the other way," he said, his voice carrying an almost casual regret. "Would have been easier for everyone." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She simply watched, measured, calculated. One of the new arrivals, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and hands like cinder blocks, rolled his shoulders. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do. "You gonna handle this, or we gonna do it for you?" His voice was deep, gravelly, completely devoid of hesitation. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. "Now, see, I was hoping we wouldn't have to get messy." He gestured vaguely at the men who were still recovering from the initial scuffle, some of them groaning, others struggling to stand. "But you went and embarrassed my boys. That's a real problem." Naomi remained still, her breathing steady, her pulse even. Calloway turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable as he glanced toward the bearded man. "Put her down." The words were spoken without urgency, almost dismissively, but the reaction was immediate. The man moved fast, faster than the others had. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Naomi barely had time to react before he lunged. She pivoted hard, instincts honed by years of training taking over. She dropped low, evading his grasp just as his arms swiped through empty air, where she had been standing a second ago. Before he could recover, she struck, a brutal, precise blow to his knee. The impact was sharp, direct, sending a shudder through his frame. A sharp grunt escaped him as his leg buckled under the force, but he was strong, too strong to go down from just one hit. The second man, younger, quicker, saw his opening. He rushed her from the side. Naomi saw the movement in her peripheral vision. Her muscles tensed, but before she could react, Max was already there. Silent, fast, a force of pure instinct. The dog launched himself forward, slamming into the man with full force. The impact was brutal. The man went down hard. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud, the force knocking the air from his lungs. His head cracked against the dirt, a sharp, ugly sound. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, chaos erupted. But there was no time to pause. The bearded man recovered quickly, his hand flying toward his belt. A knife. Naomi reacted instantly. She grabbed his wrist before he could fully draw the blade, twisting sharply until he let out a strangled groan. A second later, she wrenched his arm back and slammed him forward into the side of the truck. The impact stole the air from his lungs. One of the original gang members, still dazed from the first fight, had enough sense to recognize what was happening. "The hell is she?" His words cut off as Bolt lunged. The lean Malinois struck with precision, knocking him flat before retreating just as quickly, returning to Naomi's side. The younger enforcer had barely regained his footing when Max went for him again, snapping his jaws just inches from his face. The man flinched back, raising his hands in reflex. And that's when Naomi moved in. She grabbed him by the collar, her fingers clamping down with a firm, unyielding grip, and drove her knee into his stomach, hard. The impact was brutal, precise, sending a shock wave through his body. He crumpled almost instantly, his torso folding inward like a collapsing structure, his breath escaping in a strangled gasp. His hands instinctively shot toward his midsection, grasping at nothing, his body trying and failing to recover from the sudden, crushing force. The sound of his breath hitching, the sharp exhale of pain, echoed in the heavy silence around them. Calloway's smirk was gone now. He was watching her differently. This wasn't amusement anymore. This wasn't a game. This wasn't some woman who had gotten lucky in a scuffle. This wasn't some bystander who had thrown a few good punches out of sheer desperation. She knew what she was doing, but he hadn't figured out how. Yet. His men were still reeling, stumbling, groaning, caught between pain and disorientation. The bearded one was slumped against the truck, his chest rising and falling in uneven, labored breaths. His eyes were unfocused, his posture just shy of defeat. The younger one was on his knees, his head lowered, one arm cradling his ribs protectively, his jaw clenched in barely restrained pain. The night stretched around them, thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and the lingering trace of cigarette smoke. Calloway exhaled, rolling his shoulders with deliberate ease. "You're starting to piss me off, Carter." Naomi wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, but her breathing was still steady, controlled. She wasn't winded. She wasn't faltering. She wasn't afraid. "Walk away," she said, her voice even, unwavering. The men still standing bristled at that. Anger flickered across their faces, mixing with something else, something rawer, humiliation. Calloway tilted his head slightly, his gaze unreadable. Then, finally, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite a grin. "See? I could do that," he mused, his tone almost conversational. "Could let you walk. But here's the thing." He glanced at the others, a brief flicker of movement that didn't seem to mean much, until it did. "You're already a problem, and I don't like leaving problems unsolved." Naomi's gut tightened. She heard it before she saw it, the telltale shift of weight behind her. A small, almost imperceptible scrape of a boot against gravel, the faint rustle of movement. It was enough. She turned, just in time. The bearded enforcer, his knife was finally free. A glint of steel caught the dim light. It swung toward her. She moved, twisting sharply, her reflexes keeping her just ahead of the arc of the blade. But not completely. A sudden, sharp sting ripped across her arm. The cut was shallow, but it burned, a thin line of fire searing into her skin. Pain flared, bright and hot, but she didn't let it slow her down. She didn't hesitate. Her fist crashed into his face before he could swing again. Bone met flesh with a sickening crack. His head snapped back, his body recoiling from the force of the hit. And just like that, the fight was far from over. Blood spattered the ground as he staggered, his grip loosening. Naomi didn't hesitate. She twisted the knife from his hand, turned it against him, and drove it into his thigh. He screamed, collapsing. And then sirens. Distant, but growing louder. For the first time, Calloway's expression shifted. Not fear, not quite, but irritation. The gang members who could still move began scrambling. The bearded one was too busy clutching his leg, but the others had no interest in explaining themselves to the cops. Calloway exhaled. "Well, ain't that something?" He backed up slowly, gesturing for the others to follow. "This ain't over." Naomi stood her ground, blood dripping from her arm, Max and Bolt still poised, still ready. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had won, for now. The night air carried an unsettling stillness as Naomi Carter moved through the quiet streets, her mind still locked in the tension of the fight. She had won, but she knew better than to believe it was over. Men like Duke Calloway didn't forget humiliation. They didn't walk away licking their wounds. They plotted, regrouped, and struck back when it mattered most. She kept her eyes scanning her surroundings, instincts honed from years in the field, ensuring she missed nothing, but nothing looked different. That's what worried her the most. No lingering headlights. No movement in the alleys. If Calloway had wanted to retaliate with brute force, she would have expected to be dodging bullets by now. Instead, the town was silent. Calloway wasn't coming after her fists first. He was going to destroy her in a way she wouldn't see coming. By the time she reached her home, the tension in her muscles had settled into a slow, simmering readiness. She stepped onto the porch, unlocking her door, Max and Bolt moving in beside her as she entered. The house was still, untouched, yet that same uneasy sensation curled in her stomach. She barely slept. When dawn broke, she found herself seated at the kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee untouched in front of her. The events of the night before replayed in her mind. Every punch, every movement, every word Calloway had spoken. Then, just as the first streaks of sunlight stretched across her window, she heard it. The sound of multiple engines rolling down her street. She sat up straighter, tension rippling through her. Then came the sharp, authoritative knock. "Police! Open up!" Her grip on the coffee mug tightened. They didn't come that fast unless they were sure of something. She rose to her feet slowly. Max and Bolt already moving toward the door. Their ears perked, their bodies taut with awareness. The knock came again, harder this time. "Naomi Carter! In the door now!" She moved cautiously toward the window, angling her body so she could see the front yard without fully revealing herself. 4 squad cars, at least 6 officers, and leading the pack, Officer Trent Wilkes. Her stomach clenched. Wilkes! She knew his reputation, had heard his name mentioned enough times in connection with Calloway, a cop who knew where to look the other way when it benefited him. And now he was at her door. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. "Ms. Carter, this is your final warning," Wilkes barked. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door or we're coming in." Her breath slowed. A warrant. Her mind worked quickly, running through every possibility. Then she saw it. Through the open blinds, across the street, standing just behind the police blockade, was a face she had seen the night before. One of Calloway's men, and beside him, 2 others. Watching, waiting. The truth hit her fast. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a setup. She inhaled sharply, keeping her expression calm even as her pulse pounded. She had to think, and fast. If she ran, they'd label her a fugitive. If she resisted, they'd make sure she didn't walk out of here alive. She took another slow breath, exhaling through her nose, then moved toward the door. Her fingers brushed over Max's head. A silent command. "Stay." Then she opened it. Wilkes stood front and center, a smug expression already in place. "Naomi Carter, you are under arrest for assault and armed robbery." His tone was sharp, authoritative, designed to control the situation before she could respond. "Put your hands behind your head. Now." She didn't move immediately. "Armed robbery?" she repeated, her voice low, steady. "That's right," Wilkes said, tilting his head slightly, as if daring her to challenge him. "A store was hit late last night. Owner was badly beaten. We got multiple witnesses putting you there." The weight of the accusation sank in. They had planned this carefully. Fake witnesses, planted evidence, a respected businessman, someone the town would believe, someone whose word would stand against hers. Wilkes grinned, slow and confident, when he saw the realization cross her face. "Looks like you ain't as careful as you think." Naomi didn't rise to the bait. She simply kept her breathing even, her expression unreadable. "I want my lawyer." Wilkes chuckled. "Oh, you'll get one. But first, you're coming with us?" The officers moved in, their hands gripping her arms before she could react. She didn't resist. Didn't fight. Not yet. Because this wasn't where the fight happened. The fight happened next. As they led her toward the police car, she caught sight of Calloway's men again. One of them smirked, lifting his chin in a silent message. Checkmate. For now. The holding cell smelled like sweat and disinfectant, the kind of stale, lifeless stench that came from too many people crammed into a space meant to break them. Naomi Carter sat on the cold metal bench, her wrists still stinging from the handcuffs that had been locked too tight during transport. The station was quiet this late at night, the air thick with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of voices beyond the steel bars. She hadn't asked questions when they processed her, hadn't fought when they fingerprinted her, when they took her mugshot, when they dumped her in this cell without so much as an explanation beyond the charges Wilkes had smugly thrown in her face. She had stayed calm, because she had been here before, not in this exact situation, but in places just like this, places meant to make people feel helpless. And Naomi Carter was not helpless. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes, running through the facts. They had built their case carefully. A respected businessman assaulted. Money stolen. witnesses placing her at the scene. Calloway and his men had made sure the evidence was stacked too neatly, too perfectly. The moment the cops found that duffel bag of stolen cash in her house, it had been over. At least, that's what they thought. Footsteps echoed down the hall. She opened her eyes as Wilkes appeared outside the bars, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. "Hope the accommodations are to your liking," he said smoothly. Naomi didn't respond. Wilkes sighed, shaking his head. "See, here's the thing about towns like this. People believe what they're told. And what they've been told is that you're nothing more than an outsider with a bad temper. Came in, didn't belong, and now," he smiled, "now you're exactly where you ought to be." Still, she didn't react. He tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "You gonna say anything, or just sit there all night, pretendin' like this ain't happenin'?" Naomi finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're on Calloway's payroll." Wilkes didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He just grinned. "What I am," he said, "is smart. Smarter than you, anyway." He let the silence stretch between them before sighing, pushing off the bars. "You'll be transferred in the morning. County jail's got a nice cell waiting for you. Bet they're gonna love you in there." With that, he turned and strode back down the hall, leaving her alone in the dim light. She exhaled slowly. Morning. She wouldn't be here in the morning. Naomi had spent years in high-risk environments, where escape was the difference between life and death. She wasn't waiting for a trial. She wasn't letting Calloway's people get her inside a system where she'd never come out. She had one shot. Her eyes flicked toward the security camera, positioned just outside the holding cells. It rotated in slow, mechanical intervals, scanning the hallway before panning back to the main entrance. 4 seconds of blind spots with every cycle. She took stock of the cell. Simple, but not impenetrable. The metal bench was bolted to the wall, but the screws, old, rusted. She stood, rolling her shoulders as she walked to the bars, her fingers skimming the cold metal. They were solid, unyielding, offering nothing she could use to her advantage. There were no weak hinges, no loose bolts, no obvious flaws. But the bench? That was another story. The station was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came with small-town departments running on a skeleton crew during the night shift. 2 officers, maybe 3, if she was lucky. That wasn't a number she could rely on, and she wasn't going to wait for luck to be on her side. Lowering herself back onto the bench, she shifted her weight slightly, letting her fingers trace the bolts beneath her. They wobbled just a fraction of an inch, barely enough to notice, but enough to matter. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Taking a slow breath, she listened carefully. No voices, no movement, no indication that anyone was paying attention to the holding cell. The only sounds were the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant murmur of a television playing somewhere beyond the hallway. With quick, deliberate movements, she tightened her grip on the edge of the bench and pulled. The metal let out a soft groan, but the sound was buried beneath the constant electrical hum of the fluorescent bulbs. She worked efficiently, leveraging her weight to force the bolts to strain against their fastenings. Each subtle shift sent a small vibration through the wood, loosening the screws just enough to weaken their hold. Then, finally, she felt it. Just the slightest give. One bolt popped free, and then another, each coming loose with a faint metallic snap. Her heartbeat remained steady, even as she yanked the last one from its place. The bench wobbled slightly, still partially secured, but no longer entirely fixed to the floor. It wasn't completely detached, but it didn't need to be. It was just enough. Her eyes flicked upward to the ceiling, tracking the slow mechanical rotation of the security camera. The timing was precise. 4 seconds. She moved. Reaching down, she grabbed one of the loosened bolts and curled her fingers around it like a weapon, pressing herself against the wall. Her grip was firm, her stance measured, her muscles tense but controlled. The sound of approaching footsteps signaled her moment. The rhythm was unhurried, the cadence belonging to someone who wasn't expecting trouble. A board officer rounded the corner, his attention locked on the clipboard in his hands, posture loose and unguarded. Without hesitation, she struck. The bolt connected hard against his temple with a sharp, decisive impact. He let out a grunt, his body stumbling sideways before collapsing in a heap. The clipboard hit the ground with a dull slap, papers scattering across the floor as he crumpled. Moving swiftly, she reached down and unclipped the key card from his belt, her fingers making quick work of the attachment. There was no time to waste. Bringing her fingers to her lips, she let out a sharp whistle. Just loud enough to carry beyond the walls, but not enough to reach the front of the station. Max and Bolt would hear it. The officers up front wouldn't. Sliding the key card through the lock, she barely waited for the green light before she pushed the door open. The mechanism clicked, the latch disengaging smoothly, and she slipped into the hallway without breaking stride. She sprinted toward the side exit, her steps light and precise as she moved through the dimly lit corridor. Pushing the door open, she was met with the crisp night air, the scent of damp pavement filling her lungs as she stepped outside. Right on time, Max and Bolt emerged from the alley, their sleek forms moving like shadows against the darkness. Dropping to one knee, she ran her hand through their fur, grounding herself for a brief moment before lifting her head. Good boys. Then she ran. No sirens. Not yet. She had minutes, maybe less. She disappeared into the shadows of the town, her mind already moving ahead. She needed to clear her name. And to do that, she needed proof. Calloway thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. The night air was thick with humidity. As Naomi Carter moved through the back alleys of town, her body tense, her mind sharp. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, but she knew better than to assume she wasn't being watched. The police would have discovered her escape by now. Calloway's people would be searching for her. Every streetlight, every parked car, every window was a potential threat. But she had learned to operate in hostile territory. This town might not have been a battlefield in the traditional sense, but the same rules applied. Stay low, move fast, leave no trace. Max and Bolt flanked her, their movements fluid and controlled. They weren't just dogs. They were trained operatives in their own right, responding to her every unspoken command, scanning for threats with an efficiency most men couldn't match. She needed a plan. She needed proof. The cops weren't going to listen. The whole department was compromised. Wilkes had made that clear enough. The only way to clear her name was to find something so undeniable, so public, that Calloway and his men couldn't suppress it. And she had an idea where to start. The lights were still on inside Rachel Simmons's home when Naomi approached from the back entrance. She had known Rachel for a few months, just enough time to trust that she wasn't part of the town's corruption. Rachel had been a defense attorney in the city before moving here, and she had a reputation for fighting back against dirty cops. Naomi rapped her knuckles softly against the back door. Seconds later, it cracked open just enough for Rachel's eyes to appear wide with shock. "Naomi? Jesus! I just saw the news. What the hell is going on?" Naomi pushed inside quickly, locking the door behind her. "I need your help." Rachel didn't waste time with questions. She grabbed a remote and muted the television, where Naomi's face was plastered across the news. Fugitive, armed, and dangerous. Rachel turned back, arms crossed. "Tell me everything." Naomi kept it brief. The attack, the setup, the arrest, the escape. Rachel listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to anger. When Naomi finished, Rachel exhaled sharply. "You're right. This whole thing stinks. Calloway's got his hands deep in the police department. Wilkes has been dirty for years, but getting proof? That's not going to be easy." Naomi nodded. "I don't need easy. I need possible." Rachel ran a hand through her hair. "Look, I've heard whispers about Calloway for months. Money laundering, drugs, human trafficking. But no one talks because they're either too scared or on his payroll." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Then I need to find someone who isn't." Rachel made a call. A burner phone. No digital trail. Naomi approved. Within minutes, they had a meeting spot. An old diner on the edge of town, long since abandoned. Tyrone Jackson was already waiting when they arrived. He was a local journalist, one of the few who hadn't been bought or silenced. His articles had gotten close to exposing Calloway before, but they always got buried before the truth could spread. He stood when he saw them, his eyes scanning the area before gesturing them inside. "You've got the whole damn town looking for you, Carter. I assume that's not by choice." Naomi took a seat across from him. "I need to expose Calloway. I need proof. And I need it fast." Tyrone let out a low whistle. "That's a death wish." Rachel leaned forward. "You've been investigating him for years. You have something, don't you? Something they've been keeping you from publishing?" Tyrone hesitated, then nodded. "I've got bits and pieces, financial inconsistencies, reports of missing people who were last seen near his properties, but nothing solid enough to stick. He's smart. He keeps his name off everything." Naomi's mind worked quickly. "Then I go where his name doesn't have to be. He's running something big. If I can get inside, if I can see it firsthand—" Tyrone cut her off. "That's suicide." Naomi met his gaze, unwavering. "So was getting arrested. And yet, here I am." Rachel sighed. "If you're doing this, you need somewhere to lay low. Somewhere Calloway's people won't look." Tyrone rubbed his jaw. "There's an abandoned warehouse by the docks. It used to be part of an old shipping company before Calloway bought the land. The town thinks it's empty, but I've had sources tell me it's still active at night." Naomi nodded. "That's where I start." Tyrone hesitated. "You won't be able to just walk in. They'll have security. Cameras, probably a few armed guards." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I won't walk in. I'll find another way." They left the diner separately, Naomi taking the back exit while Rachel and Tyrone distracted anyone who might be watching. She moved quickly, making her way toward the docks. By the time she arrived, the city lights had dimmed behind her, the air growing damp with the smell of salt and rust. The old warehouse loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but not abandoned. She could see the faint glow of movement inside, shadows shifting. Max and Bolt tensed beside her. She found a vantage point, crouching behind an old shipping container, using the night as cover. Then she saw it. A truck pulled up to the side entrance. A man stepped out, exchanged words with someone inside. Then the back doors of the truck swung open. Naomi's stomach turned to ice. Inside, packed together, were people. Women. Young, frightened. Human trafficking. This wasn't just drugs. Calloway was running something much bigger. She had her proof. Now, she just had to survive long enough to expose it. The warehouse loomed against the night sky, its rusted metal siding barely reflecting the dim glow of streetlights from the distant road. Naomi Carter crouched behind a stack of old shipping containers, her breath steady, her eyes locked on the truck that had just arrived. What she had seen moments ago, women, packed together in the back of that vehicle, terrified, had confirmed every suspicion she had about Duke Calloway. He wasn't just running a criminal empire built on drugs and violence. He was trafficking human lives. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay controlled. Rage wouldn't help her. Strategy would. Max and Bolt stayed low beside her, their trained stillness matching her own. They sensed the shift in her, the heightened focus. The instinct to act now was screaming inside her, but she knew better than to charge in blindly. She needed a plan. She needed proof, and she needed to survive long enough to expose it. The truck's driver stepped out first, a wiry man with a buzz cut, smoking a cigarette as he walked toward the warehouse entrance. He knocked twice on the metal door. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing another man, heavily built, armed. A brief exchange of words, then the doors swung wider, the truck backing inside. Naomi exhaled slowly. This wasn't some backroom operation. This was something well-established, something organized. And it meant Calloway was even more dangerous than she had realized. She needed to get inside. She scanned the perimeter, her mind working through every possible entry point. The main entrance was out of the question. Too many guards, too much visibility. Then her eyes landed on a fire escape ladder along the side of the warehouse. Rusted, but still intact. It led to the roof, and from there, she could likely find a vantage point. Maybe even a way in. She moved swiftly, silently, with practiced ease, She scaled the ladder, Max and Bolt staying below, waiting for her signal. As she reached the top, she pressed her body flat against the cold metal, scanning the area. A skylight, cracked at the edges, barely held together by years of neglect. Perfect. Carefully, she peered through the glass. Inside, she could see them. The women, huddled in a far corner, their faces pale with fear. Calloway's men moved around them, checking lists, exchanging cash. A transaction. Her stomach churned. Then she saw him, Duke Calloway. He stood near the center of the room, hands in his pockets, his usual calm demeanor unshaken. Even from here, she could tell he was in control of everything happening below. He wasn't just some small-time gang leader. He was running an empire. Naomi's grip tightened against the ledge. She had what she needed. Footage of the exchange, proof of the trafficking. She pulled out her phone, angling it carefully through the crack in the skylight, recording everything. But this wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to get close enough to hear what was being said. Dates, names, locations, and she knew exactly how to do it. Naomi climbed down as quickly as she had gone up, landing soundlessly on the ground. She gave Max and Bolt a quick signal, and they followed as she moved toward the back of the warehouse where the loading docks were. The guards were stationed near the front, their attention focused on the transaction inside. That left a weak spot. Naomi moved swiftly, reaching a stack of wooden pallets near the back wall. If she could cause a distraction, something small, something subtle, she could get inside undetected. She grabbed an old piece of metal pipe from the ground and carefully wedged it against the base of the stacked pallets. Then, with a single, calculated push, crash! The pallets collapsed in a loud, echoing thunder, scattering across the pavement. Instantly, the two closest guards spun toward the noise, hands going to their weapons. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know. Go check it out." Naomi stayed pressed against the shadows as one of them moved toward the mess, his grip tightening on his pistol. The moment he was close enough, she struck. She moved fast, grabbing his wrist and twisting sharply, forcing the weapon free. A swift elbow to his throat silenced his shout before he could alert the others. He crumpled, unconscious. The second guard had barely turned before Bolt launched at him, knocking him off balance. Naomi closed the distance, driving her knee into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs before he could call for backup. He hit the ground hard. Silence followed. She exhaled slowly. 2 down. She slipped through the side entrance, moving with precision. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. The transaction was still ongoing. She moved along the shadows, creeping closer to where Calloway stood, his voice calm as he discussed shipments, buyers, locations. She hit record again. Every word was evidence. Every sentence was a noose tightening around Calloway's neck. Then, a sharp movement behind her. She turned just as one of the guards caught sight of her. His eyes widened in surprise, his mouth opening to call out, "Too late." Naomi lunged forward, slamming his head against the wall before he could react. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, but the noise had been enough. The room shifted. Calloway's voice stopped. The men closest to him turned, scanning the area. Something was wrong. Naomi's pulse quickened. She had seconds before they found her. She slipped back toward the exit, moving fast, heart pounding. She had the proof. Now she just had to make it out alive. Naomi Carter moved fast, keeping low as she slipped through the side corridor of the warehouse. The energy inside had shifted. She could feel it in the way the voices of Calloway's men had suddenly gone quiet, in the way footsteps had started moving faster, more erratic. They knew something was wrong. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath steady but controlled, her mind racing. She had the proof. The video on her phone had caught every damning word. The transaction, the trafficking, Calloway's involvement. But it wouldn't matter if she didn't make it out of here alive. Max and Bolt crouched beside her, their ears perked, their bodies taut with tension. They had sensed the change as well. The air was charged, electric. A storm was coming. A voice rang out from the main floor. "Someone's here! Find them! Now!" That was all the confirmation Naomi needed. She had seconds to get out before they locked the place down. She retraced her steps quickly, moving along the shadowed corridor toward the exit. The door she had entered through was still slightly ajar, a sliver of night beyond it. She was almost there. Then she heard it, the metallic click of a safety being switched off. "Don't move!" The voice was close, just over her shoulder. Naomi didn't freeze. She reacted. She dropped low in an instant, her body twisting as the gunshot exploded through the air, missing her by inches. She grabbed the man's wrist, forcing the weapon upward just as Bolt lunged. The guard barely had time to register what was happening before Naomi drove her elbow into his sternum, knocking the air from his lungs. The moment of breathlessness was all she needed. She wrenched the gun from his grip, twisted, and slammed the butt of the weapon against his temple. He hit the floor, unconscious, before his body even fully collapsed. The sound of the shot had sent a ripple through the warehouse. Shouts, footsteps. More of them were coming. No more sneaking. She turned to Max and Bolt, gave them a sharp hand signal, time to move. She burst through the exit, boots pounding against the pavement as she sprinted toward cover. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but there was no time to appreciate the brief relief. She heard it behind her. Doors slamming open, men spilling out. "She's there!" Naomi didn't slow down. A fence ran along the far side of the lot, separating the warehouse from the empty docks beyond. It was old, rusted, but still tall, too tall to climb quickly, especially under fire. She needed another way out. Her eyes darted around the yard, searching. The truck, the same one that had brought the women inside. It was still parked near the loading dock, engine running. A single guard lingering by the driver's side, oblivious to the chaos behind him. She made a split-second decision. She sprinted toward it. The guard turned just as she closed the distance, his hand going to his weapon, but he was too slow. Naomi's knee drove into his stomach, her hand wrenching the gun from his grasp before he even had a chance to raise it. She shoved him back, slamming his head against the truck's side panel with a dull crack. He slumped, unconscious. She threw open the driver's door, grabbing the gear shift just as bullets exploded behind her. Sparks flew as rounds slammed into metal. She floored it. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing against the pavement as she barreled toward the lot's exit. "Stop that truck!" She caught movement in the rearview mirror. Two black SUVs peeling out from the lot, headlights blinding, tires kicking up dust. Max and Bolt huddled in the passenger seat, their bodies pressed against the dashboard as the truck rattled over the uneven road. Naomi gritted her teeth, tightening her grip on the wheel. The road leading away from the docks was empty, nothing but an open stretch of asphalt lined with abandoned buildings. Nowhere to hide. The SUVs closed in fast. A burst of gunfire shredded the side mirror. Too close. Naomi slammed the wheel to the right, yanking the truck into a sharp turn down a narrow side street. The vehicle lurched, tires skidding against gravel, but she held control. She needed an escape route. Fast. Ahead, the road sloped downward toward a bridge crossing the river. If she could make it to the other side, she could disappear into the wooded outskirts of town. But then, blue and red lights flared in the distance. Police. Not just a patrol car. A full barricade. Wilkes. She had expected Calloway to send his men after her. But Wilkes, this was faster than she had anticipated. Which meant one thing. They weren't planning on arresting her. They were planning on ending this. She slammed the brakes just as the barricade came into full view. Cops crouched behind their vehicles, weapons drawn. The SUVs behind her weren't stopping either. She had been herded. Max let out a low growl beside her. Bolt's ears flattened, sensing the rising tension. Naomi exhaled sharply. This was it. No way forward. No way back. They thought they had her trapped. But Naomi Carter had never done well with cages. Her eyes flicked toward the guardrails along the bridge. Weak. Rusted. A plan formed in her mind. A dangerous one. But it was the only way. She reached for Max and Bolt, gripping their collars briefly. "Hold on." Then, without hesitation, she floored it. The truck's engine roared as she tore toward the edge of the bridge. The headlights from the police blockade flashed. She saw Wilkes step forward, his mouth moving, shouting something she couldn't hear over the sound of tires screeching. The SUVs behind her were still closing in, their drivers too focused on the chase to realize what she was about to do. Then, the impact. The rusted guardrail shattered as the truck plowed through it, metal groaning in protest before giving way entirely. And then, freefall. For a moment, everything stilled. The truck tilted forward, its weight pulling it down toward the river below. Cold wind rushed through the shattered windows, Max and Bolt bracing themselves against the sudden drop. Then, impact. Water exploded around them, swallowing the truck whole. Darkness. Silence. Then, movement. Naomi's hands found the door handle, wrenching it open as freezing water rushed inside. They had planned to trap her. They hadn't planned on her surviving. The river swallowed Naomi Carter whole. The truck hit the water hard, plunging beneath the surface in a violent explosion of foam and steel. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through her body, but her instincts took over before the pain could register. Her arms and legs moved in perfect sync, her muscles screaming as she fought against the weight of the sinking vehicle. Max and Bolt thrashed beside her, their bodies moving through the current with the same trained precision that had saved them countless times before. They knew what to do. They trusted her to get them out. She didn't have long. The freezing water burned against her skin as she twisted, pushing toward the door. The river was already swallowing the cab, darkness creeping in as the truck's weight dragged it down. Her fingers fumbled for the handle, slick with water, but she found it. She wrenched it open just as the last pocket of air disappeared. Then she kicked, hard. The river fought against her, trying to pull her deeper, but she had spent years training for survival under worse conditions. She clawed her way up, pushing through the water with everything she had. The pressure in her chest tightened. Too long without air, too deep, too slow. Then, just as her vision started to blur, she broke the surface. She gasped in a lungful of air, coughing hard as the night sky swam back into focus. Max and Bolt surfaced beside her, shaking the water from their coats, their ears flicking as they waited for her next move. She turned toward the bridge. Red and blue lights flashed against the dark sky, the beams of flashlights sweeping over the water. She could hear the shouts from above, the frantic calls between officers. "Do you see a body?" "Nothing yet. Keep looking. She has to be down there." Naomi inhaled sharply, keeping her head low. They didn't think she was dead. Not yet. She needed to move. She let the current carry her downstream, staying just beneath the surface, only coming up for quick, shallow breaths. The sound of sirens and shouting faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic rush of the river as it twisted through the outskirts of town. After what felt like an eternity, she spotted a break in the trees, a small inlet with a muddy embankment. She pushed toward it, her muscles burning as she dragged herself onto solid ground. She collapsed onto her back, sucking in deep breaths, her body trembling from the cold. She had made it out, but she wasn't safe yet. Max and Bolt nudged her, shaking water from their fur. She ran a hand over their heads, a silent reassurance before forcing herself to her feet. She had to keep moving. There was only one place she could go. A few miles south of the river sat an old hunting cabin, one she had spotted during her morning runs weeks ago. Isolated, unused, a perfect hiding spot. She moved quickly, slipping into the cover of the dense forest. Every step sent a sharp ache through her limbs, her wet clothes clinging to her like dead weight. But she ignored it. She had been through worse. By the time she reached the cabin, the exhaustion was starting to set in. She forced the rusted door open, slipping inside. The interior was sparse, dust-covered furniture, an old fireplace, and a cot pushed against the wall. Not comfortable, but safe, for now. She peeled off her wet jacket, wringing out as much water as she could before checking her phone. One bar of service. It was enough. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing on one name, Detective Luis Ramirez. Naomi hesitated. Ramirez wasn't clean, but he wasn't Calloway's kind of dirty either. He was a man who had spent years chasing ghosts, knowing corruption ran deep, but never able to prove it. He had seen enough to suspect that his own department was compromised. If anyone would listen, it was him. She hit call. The line rang twice before a voice answered, sharp and alert. Ramirez! Naomi kept her voice low. I don't have time for introductions. You're looking for me. Silence. Then, tension. Carter. A pause. You have no idea how deep in it you are. You need to turn yourself in before they find you. She let out a humorless laugh. I already know they're looking for me. I saw the lights, heard the cops shouting. Wilkes and Calloway don't want me arrested, Ramirez. They want me dead. Ramirez exhaled through his nose. You shot at officers, stole a truck, escaped custody. You think I'm supposed to believe you're innocent? Naomi's jaw tightened. Believe what you want. But ask yourself this. If they really wanted to take me in, why didn't they wait until I surrendered? Why force me off the road? Why set up a kill box? Silence. She pressed on. You know Calloway owns this town. You've been trying to prove it for years, but you don't have evidence. His voice hardened. You don't either, Naomi smirked. Check your phone. She sent a short clip from her recording, just enough to prove she wasn't bluffing. A long pause, then a low curse. Where the hell did you get this? His voice was different now, no longer dismissive. Naomi didn't answer that. You want more? We meet. Somewhere safe. No cops, just you and me. He exhaled. Damn it, Carter. If this is real, you're in more danger than you realize. That's the first thing we've agreed on. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, fine. Tell me where. Naomi allowed herself a slow breath. She wasn't alone in this anymore. It was time to bring the fight to them. Naomi Carter moved through the dense forest, her body sore, but her mind sharp. The conversation with Detective Luis Ramirez had gone as expected. Skeptical at first, then intrigued, then just wary enough to know she wasn't bluffing. The short clip she had sent him had been enough to shake him, but not enough for him to fully commit. That was fine. She didn't need him to believe her completely just yet. She just needed him to show up. The meeting location was set. An old sawmill on the outskirts of town, long abandoned, just remote enough that no one would stumble across them by accident. Ramirez had agreed to come alone. Whether or not she believed him was a different issue. Max and Bolt flanked her as she moved, their bodies low to the ground, ears flicking at every sound. The weight of exhaustion clung to her, but she ignored it. She was running on instinct now, on the kind of discipline that had been drilled into her through years of combat training. She had one shot to turn this around. If Ramirez was playing her, she was dead. If he was serious, then maybe, just maybe, she could finally expose Calloway and the entire operation before they buried her for good. The sawmill loomed ahead, its skeletal remains barely visible through the thick trees. She circled the perimeter first, checking for movement, signs of an ambush. Ramirez was smart, but she wasn't going to assume he was clean. No secondary vehicles, no fresh tire tracks, no signal interference from nearby radios. He had come alone. She moved in. Ramirez was already inside, standing near one of the old workbenches, his posture tense but not aggressive. His badge was clipped to his belt, but his gun remained holstered. That was good. It meant he wasn't planning on making this an immediate takedown. When he saw her, his expression tightened. You look like hell, Naomi smirked. Been a long night, he exhaled, watching her carefully. This is a bad idea. Meeting like this. If anyone followed either of us, we're both dead. She shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to kill me today. He didn't smile. Naomi reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She held it up, her thumb hovering over the screen. You saw the first clip. Now you see the rest. She pressed play. The footage she had recorded at the warehouse filled the screen. The exchange, the women being ushered from the truck, Calloway standing in the center of it all. The audio was clear. Names, dates, payment details. She watched Ramirez's face as he listened. His expression changed. His jaw clenched. His fingers curled slightly at his sides. He recognized the significance of what he was hearing. When the video ended, she tucked the phone away. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rustling of the trees outside. Then Ramirez spoke. "Jesus Christ." Naomi leaned against the workbench, watching him. "Still think I'm the bad guy?" Ramirez shook his head, running a hand down his face. "This is bigger than I thought. I knew Calloway was running drugs, weapons, maybe even laundering money. But trafficking? And Wilkes is covering for him?" He cursed under his breath. Naomi folded her arms. "You knew Wilkes was dirty. You just never had proof." Ramirez looked at her, something dark flickering in his eyes. "I had proof once. But it disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Evidence went missing. The kind of thing that only happens when someone up the chain makes it happen." Naomi nodded. "That's why I didn't go to the police. You're the only one who hasn't been bought off. Yet." He exhaled sharply, thinking fast. "If I bring this in, it won't last. Wilkes will bury it before it ever reaches court. We need something bigger. Something that can't be erased." Naomi already knew the answer. "We make it public. All of it. At once." Ramirez looked skeptical. "Calloway has people everywhere. If we go public, they'll come after us. Hard." She smirked. "They're already coming after me. At least this way, I get to fight back." Ramirez hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "All right. I know someone in the state AG's office. If we can get this evidence to them without Wilkes intercepting it, we have a shot. But we'll need to go big. A press release. A full public takedown." Naomi's smirk widened. "That's the plan." But Ramirez wasn't finished. "There's one problem." She raised an eyebrow. "Just one?" Ramirez ignored the sarcasm. "Calloway knows you're alive. He's not going to sit around waiting for you to make your next move. He'll come for you first." Naomi rolled her shoulders. "Then we don't wait. We hit him first." Ramirez stared at her for a long moment, then finally shook his head. "You're insane." She grinned. "That's what they keep telling me." Ramirez laid out the plan. They would use the video to bait Calloway, force him into making a move they could capture on record. Wilkes would likely try to cover for him, which would only make the case against them stronger. The goal was simple: get Calloway and Wilkes to incriminate themselves. But Naomi knew this wouldn't be that easy. Calloway wasn't stupid. He was ruthless, methodical. He would come for her. He would try to silence her before she could make it public. She was counting on it. Ramirez adjusted his holster. "We don't have much time. The second Calloway hears about this meeting, he'll move." Naomi nodded. "Then, let's get started." Max and Bolt stood beside her, waiting. Calloway had framed her. Now she was about to return the favor. Naomi Carter never expected Duke Calloway to wait. She had spent years dealing with men like him, men who built their power on fear, who stayed in control by striking first, never allowing their enemies to gain ground. She had forced him onto the defensive when she escaped, when she gathered the evidence that could bring his entire operation crashing down. Now he was making his move. And he wasn't just coming for her. Naomi was deep in planning with Detective Ramirez when her burner phone rang. The number was one she recognized. Rachel Simmons. She expected an update, maybe a warning about movement from Calloway's camp. But the moment she answered, she knew something was wrong. Rachel's voice was unsteady, breathing ragged. "Naomi? They came after me." Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. "What happened?" A sharp exhale. "Two men broke into my house. They didn't take anything. They just—" She paused, sucking in a breath. And when she spoke again, there was barely restrained fury beneath the words. "They made sure I knew this was about you." Naomi stopped walking, every muscle in her body locking into place. "Are you hurt?" A humorless chuckle. "Oh, I'll survive." Busted lip, bruised ribs. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, pushing down the anger that burned through her veins. She needed to think. She needed to stay ahead. "What did they say?" Rachel's voice hardened. "They said if I don't stop helping you next time, they won't leave me breathing." Naomi inhaled slowly, carefully controlling the tightness in her chest. "You're leaving town?" "No." Rachel's response was immediate, firm. "Rachel, I'm not running," Rachel interrupted, and for the first time, Naomi heard the same steel she felt within herself. "I knew what I was getting into, and if Calloway thinks beating me up is going to scare me off, he doesn't know who the hell he's dealing with." Naomi's respect for Rachel deepened, but that didn't change the fact that she was now a target. "I'm not giving him the chance to try again," Naomi said evenly. "I'll handle this." Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "I figured you'd say that." Naomi was about to respond when her burner phone vibrated again. Another call. She glanced at the screen. Tyrone Jackson. Her stomach turned. "Rachel, I have to go," she said quickly. "But listen to me. Stay put. Lock your doors. If anything feels off, you call me. No hesitation." Rachel hesitated, then relented. "Be careful, Naomi." Naomi ended the call and immediately answered Tyrone. "Talk to me," she said. Tyrone's voice was sharp, laced with fury. "They hit my office." Naomi's heart pounded. "How bad?" "Bad." There was a noise in the background, something being kicked over, papers rustling. "They tore through everything, smashed my hard drives, shredded my notes. They wanted me to know that nothing I had was safe." Naomi's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Did they take anything important?" Tyrone let out a bitter laugh. "What wasn't destroyed is gone. If I didn't have backups, years of work would have vanished overnight." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Then they're not just trying to scare us. They're erasing everything." Silence. Then Tyrone spoke, his voice cold. "What's the move?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "We take them down. Completely." Naomi Carter had expected retaliation the moment she slipped through Calloway's grasp, but she hadn't expected it to come this swiftly, or with such brutal precision. There was no hesitation in his actions, no slow-burning escalation of threats or warnings. He had moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent years tightening his grip over this town, making an example out of anyone who dared to challenge him. She sat in the dimly lit hunting cabin, the scent of damp wood thick in the air, listening as Ramirez paced with short, sharp strides across the uneven floorboards, his agitation barely restrained, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides, his every movement betraying the barely contained frustration roiling just beneath the surface. "Calloway isn't waiting for you to make a move," Ramirez muttered, his voice low and taut with tension. "He's already making his." Naomi leaned forward, resting her hands against the rough surface of the table between them. "Calloway thinks he's won, that I've got nowhere left to turn. That's the only reason he's being this reckless. He's making mistakes because he believes I'm cornered." She let a slow, deliberate smirk pull at the edge of her lips before continuing. "So we let him believe that." "You mean you want to bait him?" Ramirez said, his voice edged with incredulity. "Make him desperate enough to show his hand?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Exactly." Ramirez exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "That's suicide," he muttered, but the words lacked the conviction they should have had. "Not if I win," Naomi countered smoothly. The plan had to be airtight. Calloway was ruthless, but he wasn't reckless. Not normally. He would only take a risk if he believed he had no other choice, and Naomi was going to give him a reason to believe that. Ramirez made the first move, feeding a carefully crafted rumor through his trusted channels in law enforcement, ensuring it reached the right ears. The story was simple. Naomi had contacted the state attorney general's office. She had agreed to turn herself in. In exchange for immunity, she would hand over everything she had on Calloway's operation. It didn't take long for Calloway to react. An intercepted burner phone call confirmed what they had been expecting. "She doesn't walk away from this," the voice had said. Naomi and Ramirez shared a look across the dim glow of the laptop screen. "That's it," Ramirez muttered, the weight of the words settling between them. "The kill order." Naomi leaned back in her chair, cracking her knuckles, her expression unreadable. "Then let's make sure he follows through." They needed Calloway to come in person. He wouldn't trust anyone else to handle something this important, not after the way she had embarrassed his men, not when it was his reputation on the line. So they gave him a location, a deserted rail yard on the outskirts of town, isolated, the perfect place to disappear someone. Naomi would be waiting, Ramirez would be watching, and Calloway wouldn't be walking away free. The confirmation came just before midnight. 5 black SUVs moving toward the rail yard, a convoy meant to deliver the final blow. Ramirez, watching from a hidden vantage point inside an abandoned freight container, let out a low curse under his breath. "He actually showed," he muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. Naomi didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply adjusted the grip on her weapon. Her muscles relaxed but ready. Max and Bolt sat at her sides, their bodies tense with anticipation, trained instincts telling them exactly what was coming next. The first SUV rolled to a stop. Doors opened, and then Duke Calloway stepped out. He took his time surveying the rail yard, his gaze sharp as he scanned the empty space. He wasn't stupid. He knew this meeting was a risk. But then his eyes locked onto Naomi, and slowly he smiled, not out of amusement, out of certainty. Naomi met his gaze without fear, her stance unwavering. "Took you long enough?" she murmured. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head as if scolding a child. "You know, Carter, I really expected better from you," he mused. "Thought you were smarter than this." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost amused. "Funny," she said, voice cool as steel. "I was thinking the same thing about you." Calloway's smile faded. And then the first gunshot rang out. The gunshot tore through the silence, its sharp crack echoing against the rusted train cars. Naomi Carter didn't flinch, her breathing steady as her mind worked through every angle, every movement, every possible attack. The shot hadn't been aimed at her. It had been a signal. From the darkness, Calloway's men emerged, their weapons drawn, their movements sharp with confidence, believing they had her trapped. They spread out with practiced ease, creating a perimeter, their postures filled with the arrogance of men who had always operated without consequence. Naomi exhaled slowly, keeping her stance relaxed, watching as Duke Calloway stepped forward, his boots crunching over loose gravel. The smirk on his face was carefully measured, his body language casual, his every move designed to remind her who he thought was in control. "You know," he mused, shaking his head as though disappointed, "for someone who's been such a thorn in my side, I really expected you to be smarter than this." His tone was light, but the weight of the threat beneath it was unmistakable. "You should have stayed gone. Now, you're just a problem I get to solve permanently." Naomi's lips curled slightly. "You talk a lot for someone who's already lost." Calloway chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. "I don't lose, Carter." He tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "You really think this little stunt changes anything? That video you got? Cute, but I've had worse thrown at me, and I'm still standing." Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, every fiber of her being locked in place, every muscle ready. "You're still standing, because you've never been stupid enough to admit what you've done." Calloway smirked. "What I've done?" He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just slightly. "Do you even know how many people like you have tried to take me down? Every one of them thought they had me figured out. Every one of them thought they had proof. And you know what happened?" His grin widened, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "They disappeared, just like you're about to." Naomi kept her expression unreadable, her body language calm. She needed him to keep talking. Calloway's gaze flicked to Ramirez, who was standing several feet away, watching, his badge visible but his gun still holstered. "And you," Calloway scoffed, shaking his head. "I always knew you were too self-righteous for your own good. You think being a detective makes you untouchable? You think it makes you different? Let me tell you something, Ramirez. Every cop in this town works for me, whether they know it or not. You're just an inconvenience I haven't dealt with yet." Naomi saw Ramirez's jaw tighten, but he didn't move, didn't react. Calloway sighed, looking back at Naomi. Let's be real here, Carter. You don't have options. You think you're getting out of this? You think some grainy little video is going to be enough to stop me? You know how many people have tried to record me before? He let out a slow, satisfied chuckle. Evidence disappears. Witnesses disappear. And when they're gone, no one asks questions because everyone already knows the answer. Naomi let the silence stretch between them for just a moment. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. The kind of smile that made Calloway's amusement flicker with the first hint of unease. You know, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. For a man who's never been caught, you really do like hearing yourself confess. Calloway's smirk vanished instantly. And then his phone rang. Not his personal one, the burner in his pocket. The one that had just been transmitting his entire confession. Live. His fingers twitched, scrambling to pull it out. And the moment he saw the open connection, saw that he had been broadcasting to a secure number, one now sending his words straight to multiple law enforcement channels, his face paled. You, his voice broke off, eyes darting to Naomi. She reached into her jacket and held up her own burner phone. The screen was still illuminated. The call duration still running. I told you, she said softly, tucking the phone away, her voice dripping with quiet victory. You lost the second you walked in here. Rage twisted Calloway's expression, his hand darting toward his gun. But Naomi was already moving. Before he could draw, Max launched forward, teeth bared, colliding with Calloway's ribs and sending him staggering back. His gun clattered to the ground, lost in the dirt, as Bolt lunged at the man closest to him, dropping him before he could fire. Then, the chaos began. The remaining men raised their weapons, but Naomi was already in motion. She dodged left, grabbing the arm of the nearest shooter, twisting his wrist until his gun slipped from his grasp. A sharp strike to the throat sent him crashing to his knees. Gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes cutting through the darkness. But the once confident enforcers were panicking now. Their leader had just been caught. His voice transmitted to the very authorities he had controlled for so long. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. Ramirez fired, dropping 2 men in quick succession. Tyrone, who had been watching from a safe distance, triggered the media upload. Then, the floodlights blazed to life. Blinding white light illuminated the rail yard, the roar of approaching sirens growing louder by the second. The heavy sound of tires crunching over gravel signaled the arrival of law enforcement, the ones Calloway didn't own. Calloway, breathless, bruised and weaponless, stared at Naomi with pure, unfiltered hatred. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think locking me up makes a difference? Naomi met his gaze, unshaken. You're not just going to prison, Calloway. You're going to rot, the sirens wailed. The officers stormed in, and Duke Calloway, the man who had built his empire on intimidation and corruption, was finally dragged to the ground. The fight was over, and Naomi Carter had won. The sirens still rang in Naomi Carter's ears long after Duke Calloway had been dragged away in handcuffs, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like the final, satisfying beat of a long-fought battle. Even as the flashing red and blue lights washed over the rail yard, even as officers swarmed the scene to detain the remainder of Calloway's men, even as Ramirez methodically relayed details to the arriving state law enforcement officers, Naomi didn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. She had learned a long time ago that just because the fight was over, it didn't mean the war was won. Standing at the edge of the chaos, she observed everything with the careful eye of someone who had spent years navigating dangerous territory. Calloway, once so sure of himself, once so convinced that he was untouchable, now sat hunched in the back of a squad car, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him. His face was unreadable, the artificial glow of the floodlights casting sharp angles against the hard lines of his jaw. But Naomi could still see it, the bitterness in his eyes, the fury at having been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and finally defeated. She could hear the distant buzz of police radios crackling to life as officers relayed the news back to their precincts, their voices clipped and professional but unmistakably charged with energy. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the fall of a man who had controlled this town for years. Ramirez approached her, his face still tense, but his posture less rigid than before, as if for the first time in a long time he could breathe without constantly looking over his shoulder. The recordings you made, plus the surveillance footage from tonight, were already transmitted to the state's attorney general, he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. They've got more than enough now. Human trafficking, conspiracy, corruption, money laundering, obstruction of justice. The whole thing is unraveling, he exhaled, shaking his head. It'll take years to clean up the mess he made, but at least this is the beginning of the end. Naomi nodded slowly, absorbing his words, but she wasn't thinking about the logistics of Calloway's prosecution or the number of court cases it would take to fully dismantle his operation. She was thinking about Rachel, bruised and battered, but unbroken. About Tyrone, standing over the wreckage of his office, vowing not to be silenced. About every person Calloway had hurt, every life he had ruined. "Wilkes?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ramirez huffed out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Took off the moment he realized Calloway wasn't walking away from this one. But he won't get far. There's a warrant out for him. And with the evidence we've gathered, there isn't a hole deep enough for him to crawl into that'll keep him safe. His expression darkened. He should have taken the fall when he had the chance. Naomi nodded, watching as more officers loaded Calloway's men into separate vehicles. The operation moving efficiently now that the threat had been neutralized. It was over. The system that had protected Calloway for so long had finally turned on him. And yet, the weight in her chest hadn't lifted entirely. She turned slightly, looking down at Max and Bolt, both still alert despite the lack of immediate danger. She reached down, running her fingers through Max's thick coat, then over Bolt's ears. They had stayed by her side through everything, through the chase, through the firefight, through the escape, through every moment she had come close to losing. They had been soldiers beside her, and now they were survivors with her. "You did good," she murmured, the closest thing to relief she had allowed herself all night. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she let herself breathe. By dawn, Naomi found herself standing outside Rachel Simmons's house, the cool morning air crisp against her skin, the faint orange glow of the sun creeping over the horizon. She hadn't slept, hadn't even thought about resting, but there was something she needed to do before she allowed herself the luxury of stillness. Rachel answered the door quickly, as if she had been waiting, her face still marred with bruises, but her eyes sharp with defiance. The moment she saw Naomi standing there, something in her shoulders eased. "He's really gone?" Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer. Naomi nodded. "He's done. State police are taking over the case. There's no getting out of this." Rachel exhaled, crossing her arms. "I should have known you'd find a way." Naomi didn't respond, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Rachel studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Coffee?" Naomi hesitated, then nodded, stepping inside. By midday, the news had already spread. Tyrone Jackson's latest article wasn't just a report. It was an obituary for Duke Calloway's empire. His headline didn't mince words. "The Fall of a King. How one woman brought down the most dangerous man in town." The world knew now. There would be no erasing it. That evening, Naomi sat by the edge of a quiet lake, the chaos of the past few days finally settling into something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. Max and Bolt sat beside her, their ears flicking at the distant sounds of the water lapping against the shore. Ramirez had offered her a clean slate, immunity for everything that had happened, a chance to walk away without looking back. But Naomi knew she wasn't the type to just disappear. There would always be more Calloways in the world, more men who thought they were untouchable, More corruption buried beneath layers of power. She had spent years fighting wars for other people. Maybe now she'd start fighting for herself. She reached down, scratching behind Max's ears, a slow breath leaving her lips. Wherever she went next, she wouldn't be running. She'd be hunting. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.